Hello, and welcome to the Dark Ages podcast, episode 59, The Life and Lusts of Chlothar I. Today I have a goal, possibly an overambitious one. I am aiming today to wrap up the story of Clovis's sons. We've introduced 4 of them, 2 of them are already dead, and we've also covered the life and times of one grandson, Childebert. Clothar's in the title because we'll end with him, but we'll deal with his brother Childebert as well. Their stories are intertwined anyway, obviously. We'll also deal with the life and career of their grandnephew Theudebald, son of Theudebert, which unfortunately will not take long. That will bring us up to the year 561 as I push toward the end of the 6th century in Francia. It is a broad mandate kind of episode, and there will be digressions today. There's no avoiding them. In the long term, I plan to get through the 6th century in Francia and then move on to the Second Gothic War in Italy, bringing that up to roughly the same time, and then we'll have some non-narrative episodes before we set the stage for the 7th century, and I'm thinking things here like monasticism, the Avars, early Slavs, and so on. Let me know if you have specific topics you'd like to hear about. Now that I'm thinking about it, we probably do need to check in with Britain and Ireland as well. Clearly then, we haven't a minute to waste. So, when we left off last time, before I was distracted by bishops and other things, Theudebert had died in 547 after extending his kingdom to the south and west and managing to keep his royal uncles largely off his back. He passed power to his son Theudebald, and neither Childebert nor the aggressive Chlothar said a word about it. That in itself was something of a triumph. But fortune's wheel is always turning. No matter what Badger says, every single one of us lives on the rim. Please let me know if that reference landed for any of you, or if it was beyond the pale of nerdery. I'm not sure where that line is. Anyway, Theudebald was only 13 when he came to the throne, which makes Childebert and Clothar's forbearance even more surprising. He was married to a Lombard princess named Walrada, who was his stepmother's sister, and who came with the support of the Lombard king, which may have helped prop up Theudebald's reign for that dangerous early period. His father's fighting men also maintained their loyalty, and for 7 years Theudebald managed to hold his inheritance together. The one exception was the territory that Theudebert had seized in northern Italy, which was just too remote to be sustained, and which fell to Justinian's armies shortly after Theudebald's succession. The Goths down there were struggling in renewed conflict with the Byzantines, and looking for help from the Franks, but found none forthcoming. Theudebald had never been a robust young man, and his poor health caught up with him in 555. He was 20 or 21 years old when he died, and he had been king of the northern Franks as well as overlord of the Thuringians and a collection of others for about 8 years. According to Gregory, he was generally unpleasant and malicious, but even he uses the weasel word apparently, so you can give Theudebald the benefit of the doubt if you're so inclined. He had no children, and so the line of Theuderic, eldest son of Clovis, came to an end. Chlothar, making up for his earlier lethargy, was Johnny-on-the-spot about boxing Childebert out and seizing Theudebald's lands. He was so Johnny-on-the-spot it makes one wonder whether or not he had something to do with the young man's passing, but nobody ever directly said anything about it. Childebert, meanwhile, was probably distracted by his efforts to incorporate and subdue the Burgundian lands after the Battle of Autun, and by continuous campaigning against the Visigoths. In addition to the war to return his sister Clotilda, which we talked about earlier, he led expeditions into Septimania and Catalonia. He occupied Pamplona for a while, and besieged Zaragoza, which we also spoke about. Chlothar participated in some of these campaigns, but not all of them. And while these efforts were not outrageously successful, they did generate reasonable amounts of pillage and wealth. Among the spoils was a tunic reported to have belonged to St. Vincent, who had been deacon at the cathedral in Pamplona. Childebert returned with it to Paris, where he founded the Abbey of St. Vincent on the left bank of the Seine. We have here yet another Merovingian religious institution that survives to the present day, now known as Saint-Germain-des-Prés, on the same site in Paris, though nothing remains of the original building, unfortunately. The southern conquests meant that the 2 brothers were in control of more or less equal territories, though Chlothar was ahead in the treasury department. As we know from all the rest of history we've ever learned, 2 equally matched powers will always live in perfect harmony and balance with each other. I'm kidding, obviously. Chlothar and Childebert and the other brothers had collaborated on all kinds of various campaigns, of course, but as often as not, these partnerships were designed more to avoid fighting each other than to achieve coherent foreign policy goals. When the Merovingian king count was pared down to 2, opportunities to extra Frankian activities were also beginning to be thin. Tensions between the 2 grew. though no immediate cause for war presented itself right away. In addition to greater financial wherewithal, Chlothar was in possession of a potentially even greater resource in the long term. He had a packet of sons, while Childebert had only 2 daughters. And that brings us to the complicated familial relations of Chlothar and a potential rabbit warren of digression. First, though, a correction. You might remember Radegund, the Thuringian princess. When I first introduced her, I gave the impression that she spent maybe a few months with Chlothar before making her escape and founding her abbey in Poitiers. That impression was quite incorrect, and came from a misreading of Gregory on my part and not paying enough attention to chronology. What actually happened to Radegund was this. Radegund was around 11 years old when Theuderic and Chlothar conquered the Thuringian kingdom. The young princess lived on one of Clothar's estates until 540, when he finally got around to marrying her. She would by then have been around 20, with him in his early 40s. By the standards of the time, that makes the whole thing at least a little less icky, though I know that today the pair would still receive a lot of side-eye. The two had no children, and Radegund was popular with the people of Clothar's realms for her charitable work. It was said that Chlothar had married a nun, not a queen, she was so pious, and Chlothar seems to have respected her for it. The early Merovingians in general, and Chlothar in particular, saw no reason to abandon polygamy no matter what the bishops said about it. Sometimes it may have simply been rapid-fire serial monogamy, but the bishops didn't like it either way. Radegund was one of a total of 6 wives or long-term concubines taken by Chlothar in the course of his life, that we know of. Dates are tenuous, so it's hard to say how many were around in his household at any given time, but it's pretty clear that at various points during her time in Clothar's household, Radegund would have been living with between 1 and 3 co-wives, most notably the sisters Ingund and Aragund. I'll come back to those 2 in a minute. But how Radegund felt about all of this is not known. She lived as Clothar's wife for about 5 years altogether, until Chlothar tracked down and executed her last remaining brother, possibly because he had been involved in a Saxon rebellion. Either fearing that she might be targeted, or simply unwilling to live with her brother's murderer, Radegund fled and used her connections to set up the abbey at Poitiers. I lean toward the former explanation for the simple reason that Chlothar and Theuderic had already been responsible for the deaths of most of the rest of her family, and it would have been an odd place to finally draw a line. Not to mention the unfortunate reality that the practices of war meant that it was very common for women to wind up in the beds of their family's destroyers. Chlothar made several attempts to bring Radegund back, but he didn't really put his back into it. Radegund was well connected with influential churchmen all over Francia and beyond, and forcing her to return would probably have brought all kinds of problems for the king. He supported her and the abbey financially until his death, and seems to have been overall fairly sanguine about the whole thing. After all, he had other wives, and the marriage certainly was not a towering inferno of passion as far as we can see from this distance. Clothar's first wife we've already mentioned. It was his brother Clodomer's widow, Gunthiak. Maybe she had eyes that could steal the sailor from the sea, or maybe it was the access to his brother's lands and treasury that attracted Chlothar. Who can say? They had been married shortly after Clodomer's death in 524, but had no children, and Gunthiak died sometime around 532. It was a pattern Chlothar would repeat. After Theudebald's death, Chlothar apparently started an affair with his widow, until his bishop's objections finally forced him to break it off and find her a husband from among his own nobles. Radegund we've covered. Clothar's most successful marriage, if we're just scoring by offsprung, was to a woman named Ingund. Ingund was a daughter of King Baderic the Thuringian, and was thus a cousin of Radegund. She had been Clothar's concubine beginning in around 517, when she would have been 18 or 20, and he married her about the time of Gunthiak's death. Ingund was Clothar's longest relationship, and together they had 4 sons and a daughter. All 5 surviving children would be kings and queens in their time, but we will not be dealing with them today, and I can only imagine your relief. It probably matches my own. Ingund and Chlothar seem to have gotten along well together, as far as we can tell about these things. Gregory says that he loved her with all his heart, though that didn't keep him from having some out-of-the-box ideas. One day, Ingund came to her beloved husband with a request. Again, according to Gregory, "My lord, to complete my happiness, I ask that you choose for my sister, who is also a member of your household, a competent and worthy husband, so I need not be ashamed of her, but rather that she may be a source of pride for me, and so that I may serve you ever more faithfully." Well, thought Chlothar, that's going to be tricky. A worthy and competent spouse for the queen's sister. Who among his nobles could he find to marry his sister-in-law? Aragond was a little younger than Ingun, of royal blood in her own right, as well as by marriage. Whatever noble secured such a match would be bound closer to the king, which would improve internal relationships. Or there might even be some outside king and neighbor whose goodwill could be assured by such a marriage. Both of those would be good options, but hey, wait a second. Now that's an idea. What about me? According to Gregory, Chlothar went to the house where Aragond was staying, married her, and had his way with her before returning to England. I have done my best to reward you for the sweet request you have put to me. I have looked everywhere for a wealthy and wise husband who I could marry to your sister, but could find no one more eligible than myself. You must know then that I myself have married her. I am sure that this will not displease you. I'm going to pause for a moment and let you imagine how this approach might be received if you were to try it on your significant other. Personally, I would make sure to hide all the sharp objects and heavier frying pans before I started, but then again, I am not a long-haired king of the Franks. For Ingun's part, she simply replied, "You must do as you wish. All I ask is that I retain your good favor." And Chlothar and Aragond would go on to have one child, a son. Gregory frames this whole story as an example of Clothar's lustful nature. He was too given over to woman-chasing to resist. While that may have been part of his character, he does seem disinclined to deny himself anything, there may have been more behind Clothar's actions here. In 1959, a sarcophagus was discovered beneath the Cathedral of Saint-Denis. It contained the remains of a woman buried between 580 and 590. Along with an array of well-preserved grave goods, including garments of silk, there was a ring, inscribed with the legend, Arnegundus Reginae. There are the usual packet of caveats and warnings about positively identifying the corpse, but assuming this is indeed the Lady Aragond herself, then her skeleton reveals a couple of interesting things. First, she gave birth to a child when she was in the neighborhood of 18. Second, she would have walked with a pronounced limp, probably thanks to an encounter with polio in her youth. It's possible that Aragond's disability actually presented difficulties in finding for her a suitable marriage, and that Chlothar married her to avoid having an unmarried relative who might reflect poorly on himself. We could even accept the idea that it was an altruistic move, motivated by pity or at the request of Ingund herself. This last possibility is the one that I favor, actually, because after Ingund died around 546, Aragond found herself out of favor with Chlothar, and it may have been that her sister's goodwill was the only thing maintaining her position at court. Clothar's last marriage was to a woman named Cunsina, and we know pretty much nothing at all about her, or the circumstances of their marriage. All we know is that she had a son by Chlothar named Cram. Cram, by the way, means raven. So, by the time we have added up the scores, when all the begetting has been begotten and done with, what are we left with? We are left with Childebert in control of most of a kingdom centered mainly on Paris or Orleans, and including most of the former Burgundian lands. Along the way, he had taken control of Provence, finally giving the Franks that Mediterranean port they'd been fighting for decades, and he has 2 daughters. Set against him, we have Chlothar, who has gobbled up the bulk of the northern and eastern territories, extending as far as Bavaria, and who controls the strategically important Auvergne. In the family derby, he's the runaway winner, with at least 8 children surviving into adulthood. It's entirely possible, and even likely, that there were plenty of other children who died young, or who had the misfortune of being born girls whose marriages were not glittering enough to attract chroniclers' attention. C'est la vie. The rest of the episode, then, will be concerned with just the one of those children of Chlothar, his son, Cram. Cram was the son of Clothar's last wife, Cunsina, who is not otherwise mentioned anywhere in the sources. It's hard to say when exactly he was born, though he was definitely Clothar's youngest son. In around 555, he was sent by his father to pacify the Auvergne. The region had a strong Gallo-Roman aristocracy and an independent streak that made rule by any king, Visigoth or Frank, difficult. For Cram to have been given such a responsibility, he had to have been at least a teenager. I'm busking here, but I would say that puts his birthday between 535 and 540. Please do not quote me on that, because I know you're out there quoting me regularly at the sports bar, and it needs to stop. Per Gregory's account, Cram was a bad egg. He was wildly unpopular as governor in Clermont-Ferrand. He surrounded himself with people who were full of bad advice and worse impulses. Gallo-Roman aristocrats were ousted from their positions and driven into exile or hiding, and the local bishop worried that he would be treated similarly. This particular bishop probably should have been exiled, but that's another story. Worst of all, certainly to the modern reader, Cram's order was that the daughters of certain senators were to be forcibly abducted for his entertainment. We should probably talk a little bit more about the general position of women and the general attitude and actions of especially aristocratic men towards them, but that'll be a pretty grim episode, and I'm going to put it off for a while. So where was Dad when all of this was going on? Whether he sympathized with the subjects of Clermont was irrelevant. His son's behavior reflected poorly on Clothar's reputation, and he should have put a stop to it. Unfortunately, at the time, Chlothar was busy with other matters. The Saxon residents, formerly under Theudebald's rule, wondered if they really wanted a Frankish king and rebelled in 555. Chlothar smacked that rebellion down and imposed an annual tribute of 500 head of cattle on the Saxons as a fine. The next year, he heard that a second rebellion had bubbled up, gathered up his army, and went to deal with the Saxons again. But when he arrived, he met emissaries of the Saxons who sued for peace. They offered to increase the tribute, and Chlothar was inclined to take the peaceful way out. His army, though, had come expecting a fight. They were spoiling for a fight, and they were spoiling for spoils, and they would not be talked out of it even by their king. It's possible, even likely, that rumors of this second Saxon uprising had been started and spread by Childebert, seeking to destabilize his brother's rule. Because, after all, how powerful could a king be if he couldn't control his own army? Eventually, Chlothar succumbed to the demands of his men and attacked the Saxons. The battle was bloody, inconclusive, and ultimately pointless. In the end, a peace was patched up, and Chlothar was able to return home. Cram, meanwhile, eventually left Clermont-Ferrand and moved to Poitiers, where he continued to be malicious and unpopular. He had got it into his head that he could gain some advantage by allying with his uncle Childebert against his father. I could not tell you what he thought he would gain. It makes very little sense, and Gregory is not very illuminating. The only thing I can think of is that as the youngest son by a different mother from all his brothers, he may have expected to lose the inheritance game. By ingratiating himself with his sonless uncle, he might make out better when the Green Reaper came calling for Dad, but that's me speculating. I don't think it's wild speculation, but it is speculation. Childebert welcomed his nephew with open arms and his fingers crossed behind his back, figuratively speaking. He had every intention of betraying Cram in turn, though he seems to have enjoyed the plotting and the planning too much to be in a hurry. Cram married the daughter of one of Childebert's nobles and had a son, who he named Childebert. Cram then declared his rebellion against his father openly, and claimed all of the territory over which he had ever held authority, or even had visited, centered on the Limousin. Chlothar was still patching up the Saxon rebellion, so he sent two of his other sons, Childebert and Guntram, to sort things out. They found Cram near a hill called Niremont, where now a town called Saint-Georges stands, and offered him a simple ultimatum. Either return all the territory he had usurped, or draw up his army and fight. Cram offered to hold the lands in his father's name, which doesn't really seem like giving a lot of ground, and the brothers were not having it. They would have their battle. Bad weather delayed the engagement, and Cram tried a new tactic. He found a messenger his brothers would not know to bring news that their father had been killed in his fight with the Saxons. Childebert and Guntram withdrew into Burgundy to wait for confirmation, while Cram moved quickly northward to capture Chalon and lay siege to Dijon. Childebert also heard that Chlothar had been killed by the Saxons, who now actually were in earnest rebellion and raiding Clothar's eastern territories. Childebert believed he could seize all of Francia for himself and pushed to occupy as much as he could, especially around the royal city of Reims. The church was pulled into the growing civil war. Almost every diocese had at least one noble cleric who believed he deserved the post more than the incumbent bishop, and in sees where vacancies arose, candidates aligned with whichever side they thought would be most advantageous to them. As an example, one Austrapius, a secular noble who had once been imprisoned by Cram, was ordained a priest and later bishop of Champtocé, with the understanding that he would have the much richer Poitiers when the incumbent there died. The arrangement was blocked by Childebert, who installed his own man at Poitiers and ignored Austrapius' protests. Austrapius returned to his own lands, where he ran into a blast from our podcast past. The settlements of the Tifoli, who I last talked in detail about way back in episode 2, they were a possibly Sarmatian tribe that had crossed the Danube along with the Goths in 376. Many of them had attached themselves to Alaric's Visigoths and had been settled in Gaul and served as cavalry units in the Roman armies. Now here they are, still recognized by Gregory, at least as a distinct people, in the 550s and 60s. Anyway, the Typhli were oppressed by Bishop Astrapius, though he does not elaborate exactly what that means, and they rebelled and killed him. The bishopric of Chantoceaux was absorbed into that of Poitiers, and its bishop continued to be the loyal placeman of Childebert. It turned out to not be very long, though. Childebert fell ill, and after lingering a while, died, in the year 558. He was probably about 62 years old, and had been a king of at least some of the Franks for 47 years, which is surprising given how little impression he makes. It's not that he was a bad king, he just has never really emerged into the spotlight here, and now it's too late. Farewell, King Childebert. Emerging from nesting digressions, Chlothar, still alive and I'd imagine fairly miffed at his brother's and youngest son's conduct, quickly took control of Childebert's lands. In 558 he thus became the first sole ruler of Francia since the death of his father Clovis in 511. By now he was pushing 60, which was downright ancient for the time, and so is known in some history books as Chlothar the Old. He began by tidying up loose ends. Childebert's widow and daughters were sent into exile, but Cram remained unreconciled. Having run out of uncles, and his brothers being of no help, Cram looked to the west. The Bretons were nominally within the Frankish king's bailiwick, but in practice operated entirely independently. Refugees from the ongoing invasions of Britain were still streaming into Brittany, giving it its name and its Celtic flavor, distinct from the rest of France. They fought among themselves, raided the Frankish lands, and ignored the directives of whichever Merovingian king saw fit to try and command them. One of the Breton chieftains, named Chenau, gave refuge to Cram. Often, as one is reading Gregory of Tours' history, there are interspersed stories of events either natural or miraculous. They seem at first glance to be non sequiturs that interrupt the narrative, but on closer inspection they usually reflect or comment on the action, either immediately before or after. One of the most obvious of these passages comes just after Cram flees to Brittany. 2 swarms of locusts appeared at this time. They passed through the Auvergne and Limousin, and are said to have penetrated as far as the plain of Romagna. There they fought a great battle, and many were killed. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think I've ever heard of swarms of locusts fighting each other. Don't they usually merge? Given how central to the human protagonists Auvergne and Limousin have been, it's not too much of a leap to suggest that Gregory is commenting on both the destruction that will be wrought by the coming struggle, and on the greed and immorality of the prince and king. Gregory also strengthens the biblical vibe by overtly comparing Chlothar and Cram to King David and his rebellious son Absalom, a story found in the 2nd book of Samuel. Chlothar gathered an army and marched into Brittany to capture his son and punish the Bretons for sheltering him. The night before the battle was set to begin, Chenau tried to convince Cram to hold back from fighting himself, as it would be wrong to fight against his father directly. Cram would not be put off, though, and in the morning the 2 armies fought. The Bretons were broken. Chenau fled but was killed in the rout. Cram attempted to run as well. He had had ships made ready on the coast exactly for this moment, but was delayed when he tried to rescue his wife and daughters. They were all together when Clothar's army caught up with them. Chlothar had run out of patience and mercy. He had Cram and his family burned alive in the house where they were being held. Chlothar was old now, and tired, and probably suspected the end was near. In 561 he made a pilgrimage to Tours, and confessed his sins before the altar, and upon the relics of Gregory's beloved St. Martin. A short while later, while hunting, he contracted a high fever, and was taken to his villa at Compiègne, where he died, on the 1-year anniversary of the execution of Cram. He was around 64 or 65, and had been king of the Franks for 51 years, and king of the Franks for 3. Through his own efforts, and those of his brothers and nephews, the Merovingians now ruled over the largest kingdom in the post-Roman West, including all of modern France except Septimania, the Low Countries, and most of modern Germany. He was undoubtedly just as ruthless, violent, and untrustworthy as any of his relatives, but he was in the end the last man standing, and the only one to have sons to pass his inheritance on to. Those 4 surviving sons buried their father at Soissons, and prepared to decide how this massive inheritance would be carved up. So next time we will have to deal with the 4 sons of Chlothar the Old, faced with dividing up the old man's kingdom as fairly as possible. It was exactly the same position the sons of Clovis had found themselves in when he had died 50 years before. History, as they say, does not repeat, but it does often rhyme. We'll see just how much it rhymes next time. Until then, thank you for listening, and thank you for everyone who messaged me or supported the podcast during the absence. It's been humbling that you care enough to do that, and you're the ones who make this whole thing worthwhile. There's been a bit of a backlog, and so there's too many thank yous to do individually, but my gratitude goes out to each and every one of you. Until next time, take care.